I got into the paranormal really through people is the short answer to that, and their own experiences of the same. And I do work from within the academy, but that just happens to be where I'm at, Daniel. I mean, you work from where you're at, and I come in and I talk about everything from UFOs to near-death experiences to religious beliefs in a way that anthropologists and literary critics and historians can recognize. And so that's really the goal, is to sort of mainstream that conversation and authorize it in an academic or a research setting.
Hey everybody, today I'm here with Jeffrey Kripal, an extraordinary thinker and author who is one of the rare people, kind of like myself, who explores the psychic, the paranormal, the sort of other dimensional realities. But he does it from within kind of the academy, within the university system. His most recent book is How to Think Impossibly, where he looks at UFOs, souls, time, belief and everything else. He also wrote Authors of the Impossible, which is a fantastic book talking about sort of pioneers in paranormal thought like Frederick Meyer and Charles Fort and so on. And yeah, I'm really delighted. We had our first meetup when I did my Future of Consciousness course. And so I thought we could just hone in on a few other topics and just explore some stuff today. And yeah, if you're watching this, if you like this kind of content, why not like, subscribe? It costs you nothing. It makes the everything blossom apparently in the YouTube tree. Yeah, Jeffrey, thanks for joining us. Would you want to give us a little bit about your background and how you got sort of interested in this? How you sort of arrived on these topics, the paranormal and so on, as your kind of life focus and life mission in a way.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, Daniel. I'm looking forward to this. Um, a few years ago, I wrote a memoir called Secret Body, and it's the subtitle is Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religions. And that kind of sums up my sort of the life path, as it were. I started out looking at ecstatic religious experiences and the relationship to human sexuality, which was a pretty traditional, I don't say traditional, but a pretty mainline concern in the humanities in the 90s. And I ended up writing about the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, and what was known as the Human Potential Movement. And it put me in touch with a lot of people who had extraordinary stories. And I realized, talking to them over many years, that these things essentially did happen to them, and that we didn't really have any way of talking about them adequately, and certainly in the academy. And so I got into the paranormal really through people is the short answer to that, and their own experiences of the same. And I do work from within the academy, but that just happens to be where I'm at, Daniel. I mean, you work from where you're at, and I come in and I talk about everything from UFOs to near-death experiences to religious beliefs in a way that anthropologists and literary critics and historians can recognize. And so that's really the goal, is to sort of mainstream that conversation and authorize it in an academic or a research setting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, somehow you found a rhetorical framing or a way of speaking about this stuff, as you say, that allows the academy to kind of like kind of integrate it or process it to some extent. I mean,
Well, yeah. I mean, one of my sensibilities or my strong conclusions over the years is that actually intellectuals are very comfortable with this. They tend to be in the closet, and they don't, it's not that they don't recognize it, they don't know how to talk about it. And so, and yet the tools of the humanities and the social sciences are really wide open to these kinds of experiences and are very useful in talking about. Hence, the book you mentioned, Authors of the Impossible, it's essentially uses literary theory to talk about the paranormal, and it's a fairly easy thing to do because I think these experiences are woven into the academy, in a really dramatic way.
But wouldn't you say though there has been a strong bias towards kind of like reductive materialism? In I mean, because I mean, as somebody who tried to, you know, bring this type of material into the public discourse, I found that yeah, people really had no, were not able to handle it. There was, I've never been invited to give a talk at a university, basically.
I
Um,
think that's a I think that's fair. I mean, I think that that materialist, or what I call this horizontal ideology is still in place, and it reigns not only in the sciences but in the social sciences and the humanities as well. And so, any time you talk about the vertical or something intervening into this material landscape, you're pushing against the reality assumptions of whatever your listener is. I think that's true still, but I think there's a lot of opening. There's a lot of capacity there for that kind of conversation, even though we haven't had it in the last 50 or 60 years.
yeah, we really have not had it, which is kind of astonishing. I mean, University of Virginia, the Department of Perceptual Studies, that seems to be like one of the only places where there's a kind of capacity to investigate this type of material. Um, and
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, my joke is the whole study of religion. You can't even talk about religion without thinking about something extraordinary or paranormal happening. I mean, I don't see how you get around it, although people do get around it constantly. I mean, the religion gets reduced to this horizontal social or political plane, and the vertical or the revelation dimension gets ignored. I understand how that happens, but I don't think that's adequate.
yeah, well, I mean, I think it comes from the big shots of the late 19th century, for in early 20th, Freud and Marx, right? Marx was like, religion is the opium of the people, where it's actually a materialist reality. And Freud was also a materialist, and he was like, religion is a sublimation, or a way to avoid the fear of death and so on. So Nietzsche, I mean, yeah, so all the big shots of the late 19th century kind of in a way ignored or downplayed the supernatural and the psychic. And for a long time, it was really something that could not really be allowed into serious discourse. Like the Society for the Psychic Research, they were serious academics and Cambridge scholars and so on. And I think once they were kind of embarrassed because they were studying, like, you probably know more about this than I do. They were studying certain mediums, channels, and they discovered they were fakes. And that was kind of the last time, I think. At that point, there was like a schism between, the materialism, which became the academic, mode of kind of understanding. And then anything like psychic and paranormal was more in the sort of occult, squishy new age, like weird Hindu or, evangelical, Christian Scientology or whatever, or Christian Science, whatever. I don't know. Is that how you see it? Or
No, I don't see it that way. I mean, I think that's the standard narrative. I mean, I think that's the assumption, but in fact, the intellectual history is just riven with paranormal currents. It's just everywhere. Um, and I write a lot about what I call the superhumanities, and the superhumanities are basically the humanities with a focus on altered states and psychical experiences, and they're everywhere. I mean, including Nietzsche, by the way. You mentioned Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche's filled with ecstatic altered states that just get elided in the sort of standard reception history of Nietzsche. And Freud, even Freud was, he was a good friend of Romain Rolland, who was essentially a French mystic and somebody who was really committed to a kind of spiritual but not religious worldview before there was even a name for it. So there are they're not just moments, Daniel, they're like major components of our intellectual history that we've simply forgotten or shoved aside because of these materialist ideologies that you're speaking about. I mean, I think that's absolutely true that has become an ideology or the norm, the normal story, but it's not actually what happened.
yeah, I mean, I would still kind of stick to my guns and say, like, I mean, Nietzsche definitely, was not talking about like kind of a supernatural cosmos. Like Rudolf Steiner went and visited him on his deathbed, and sort of saw the forces of materialism, and also Nietzsche's evolutionary reports. But then you have like Freud. He wrote that essay on the uncanny. But essentially, there was this rift between Freud and Jung, because I mean, for Jung, the world of archetypes, in a way, is a kind of spiritual world. And Jung has even said at some point that the archetypes, could be called
Yeah.
spirits.
Yeah.
So there was a certain way that from Wittgenstein, from Bertrand Russell, who said that the universe is just built on despair, and there's no possibility of like transcendence. We should accept that as our burden. And also growing up to the culture that I grew up in New York, in the 70s. I didn't meet one person who believed in God, who believed in anything spiritual, who believed in the psyche or the supernatural. I mean, anything paranormal was assumed to be a kind of like self-delusion, like there was like there was like a pattern, and you mistook the pattern for some kind of evidence or something. So I mean, to me, there was like a huge force of societal and cultural repression on anything related to the psychic and the paranormal. And that has started to lift, although it's lifting in different ways now, not all of them great. As for instance, we see with sort of the QAnon, right-wing conspiracy world, and the sort of Christian yearning for an apocalypse and so on. Kind of like the yearning for transcendence, or for some encounter with something transcendent, seem to be taking some very dangerous forms right now, I would say.
Yeah, and I think those two things are related. I mean, I think that ideological cultural narrative that you were speaking of in the Northeast in particular actually produces its opposite, or helps, or at least confirms its opposite, which is this conspiracy thinking, and so the denial of any kind of transcendence creates a kind of rigid horizontalism or localism, or social political norm that I think produces its opposite. And what I'm trying to say is that if you actually look at particularly intellectual history, it's actually much more complicated than you grew up with in New York in the 1970s. I mean, I grew up in the 1970s as well. I grew up in Nebraska, and it was a different kind of culture than that, but not still. It still is this materialist kind of physicalist assumption that I think is the norm, but it's just, again, the culture is just riven with these moments where it's not that. And so what I'm trying to do is just say, let's try to pay attention to those moments when it's not, that something else is coming through. And you find it in the darndest places, including in these people that apparently or assumedly are bastions of materialism and secularism.
Like who are some of those people? Or you met like the ones you mentioned, like Freud and Nietzsche and so on.
Well, Nietzsche and Freud are perfect examples, but I mean, you could go through the 19th century. It certainly produced this sort of industrial materialism that you're speaking about, that then comes to reign in the 20th century. But it also produces anthropology and the comparative study of religion and psychical research and all of these things that, I mean, Frederick Myers was a 19th century intellectual figure, that you mentioned. Charles Fort was an American writer really writing in the 1920s and early 1930s. And science fiction is the way that this gets framed in some ways in the 20th century. So it's okay to receive it as entertainment or as fiction, but it becomes not okay to talk about it, as some part of our reality, which is what you were speaking to, I think.
Yeah, exactly. They found different ways to sort of channel it out or suppress it, and one being storytelling, fiction, Um, um, yeah, I
I,
mean,
you know, I could to go back just to kind of go to the book, How to Think Impossibly. I mean, one of the things I often say is that the idea that these experiences are rare is a function of the censorship. It's actually not true. But we think they're rare and we think they're extraordinary because the social pressure is so strong to not tell these stories, you know. And so I think that's the case with intellectual history as well. We just assume that these experiences are not in these figures, and so we tell these stories, or we remember the lives or the works of these people in a particular way, but it's just not true. If you just read the books and you read the lives, it's just, again, it's riven with this stuff, as it is today. And as you said, it gets channeled into disturbing moral and political ways, but it also comes out in other ways as well, in film and television, and in the popular culture, as it were.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious, was there some experiences that you had as a young person that somehow particularly opened you to this, or was there just a...
Well, yeah, I mean, what I often say is that I had a major out of body experience in Calcutta, actually, in 1989. That really opened me up and made me sympathetic, but I wasn't interested in writing about these things. It was really these people that I met in the 2000s that opened me up intellectually and historically to the importance of this. So, but yeah, there was a kind of existential or personal grounding or opening sympathy that required a certain kind of experience. I say yes, so absolutely yes, but it wasn't immediate, and it wasn't this intellectual conversion experience that I think we think about.
It wasn't like you had a paranormal, it wasn't like an ET jumped out at you from a UFO or anything like that. It was more of an intellectual...
Well, I'll just tell you the experience. I mean, I'm laughing because it kind of is that. I mean, it's like, I mean, an ET did not jump out at me, by the way, but I was living in Calcutta. I was writing about, actually, Shakta Tantra is what I was working on for my dissertation, and I had one of these experiences. I think a medical professional would call it a sleep paralysis event. But it involves some kind of energy, in the room or in my body, or something, some kind of presence that overwhelmed, certainly my awareness, or my consciousness, and did things to me. It wasn't me, it was something else. It was doing this to me. And at some point it imploded into my chest area, and then I had this out of body experience, and I floated to the top of the ceiling, like people talk about, and had a kind of classic near death experience, and then came back into my body eventually, and just felt like something had been transmitted into me, or, as they would say later, downloaded. So it was dramatic, you know. I framed it entirely in Shakta Tantric terms. It made a lot of sense in terms of the religious language or the philosophies I was studying, but you could just as easily see it as an abduction experience, or as some other kind of experience that people talk about. So I think that's what gave me
Yeah.
the really existential, because what I said to myself inside was, oh yeah, that can happen. Oh yeah, that can happen.
Yeah.
Because it happened. I mean, come on, you're not going to tell me it didn't happen. Of course it
Yeah.
happened.
Right. There's something about the, direct phenomenological experience that changed everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and then later, because I was trained to study religion and people's religious experiences, I mean, I was open to this other kind of dimension, or I understood religious experience in ways that were not just historical or social or political or neurological.
When you were studying Shakti Kali, was it mainly an intellectual pursuit, or were you also doing embodied practices like tantric rituals and so on?
Yeah, it was both. I mean, come on, this was sort of one of my early entry points into the study of religion, and the weirdness of scholars of religion. They don't study these things for the hell of it,
Yeah.
Daniel. I mean, it's my joke is it's a weird kid who wants to grow up and be a scholar of religion. Nobody says that. I mean, you back into it because of some set of experiences or some conflict or some deep burning question you have. And so that was really my entry point into the inner lives of other historians and scholars of religion, was my own life.
Yeah. Let's skip ahead and talk about this most recent book for a minute. Kind of tell me
Yeah.
what I understand that you also had kind of a bit of a psychic experience around the title and so on. Didn't the title come to you in a dream or something like that? Uh,
No, no, it actually came to me from my editor. It's it's yeah, no, it didn't. I'm
okay.
sorry. I
Well,
mean, we could say it did, but it didn't.
what was the genesis of this book, and what did you feel was really important to get out?
Well, I wrote this earlier book that you mentioned called Authors of the Impossible.
I love that book. Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. And How to Think Impossibly is really a kind of, how do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we think impossibly? And thinking impossibly, by the impossible, of course, I don't mean it's physically or literally impossible. I mean it's impossible because of one's worldview. We say it's not possible because of our assumptions about reality, when in fact these things happen all the time.
Yeah.
And so Authors of the Impossible is really about authorizing these experiences. Thinking impossibly is not reducing these experiences to one's religious system or to one's secular scientific system. It's really letting these experiences speak, because that's what I think they're trying to do. I think they're trying to communicate to us, and listening to these experiences in ways that can produce a new worldview that's neither religious nor scientific in the conventional senses.
Yeah. I'm curious a bit more about how you conceptualize that, the impossible, and which thinkers have kind of added kind of richness to your exploration of that idea.
Well, again, there's so many people in the history of the study of religion and philosophy that I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I think so many people are pushing on this envelope. But what that book does, the people that I'm most interested in engaging, I call it thinking with, and I use a hyphen, and it's the experiencers. It's the people who have the experience of the insectoid or of the AI alien, or of the out of body, the near death experience, or the precognitive dream, or whatever it is. I'm most interested in those people who have those spontaneous, out of the blue experiences that just rock them.
Mm.
Um, Ontological shock was a phrase made famous in the 90s by John Mack, but it actually, again, goes back to a scholar of religion, by the way, a theologian named Paul Tillich, who coined it in the 1950s. So I really am interested in that ontological shock and that wrenching of reality and what those experiencers have to say. I think those experiencers want writers and intellectuals to think with them and to think about their experience. But I think intellectuals and writers need those experiencers desperately to have, to have something to think about.
Do you see a way to, I guess, kind of construct a sort of expanded, ontology or scientific worldview that allows for these types of ontological shock experiences to have coherence or make sense? Or do you think we're not really there yet?
Well, of course, we're not there yet, but again, we have resources.
Yeah.
My general feeling about it, Daniel, is that a number of years ago, I invited a bunch of people to the Esalen Institute, and I asked them to come with two things. One was the most extraordinary thing that ever happened to them, and the other was a theory of the imagination that would make that extraordinary thing possible or sensible. Every single person came with some drop your jaw, what the fuck experience. Nobody came with a theory of the imagination, not a single person. And so I realized, and that's not to critique them or criticize them. I realized at that moment that well, we have these experiences that knock us out of our worldviews, but we actually don't have a theory of the imagination to make sense of these things or to make the impossible possible, as I say.
But
And so that's what I set out to do.
we have like, William Blake talks about the imagination is not a state, it's the human existence in itself, in a way.
I
Yeah.
mean, again, if you're a Blakean, if you how do we socialize or integrate your reason and Blake into American culture? I mean, we do it to a certain extent. We have done it in the counterculture. Blake became really popular in the American counterculture. So we have these resources like Blake. Blake is one of them. But we tend not to integrate those folks or to think about, we think of the imagination as just the imaginary, as something we made up. It's schlock. We don't think of the imagination as a medium or as a translator of some greater truth, which is more along the lines of what Blake thought. Although, one of the things I struggle with in that book is I think if someone wants to be generous, they'll say, oh, well, a vision is about some kind of mediation or some kind of translation. But what if it's not? What if it is what it is?
Yeah.
What if the vision is the vision? And
I think
what
it
if the
says in the Talmud, the dream is its own interpretation.
yeah, that leads to a particular kind of quandary. And one of the things I do in the book, I do a lot in the book, is I talk about precognition. And I basically say, well, what does the universe have to look like to make precognitions possible at all? And that it then leads to a particular kind of cosmology or worldview and a particular view of time that is shocking to people
Mm.
and calls into question, basic assumptions of linearity and causality and a kind of one-way temporality that I think is mistaken, and I think our experiences show that. But we ignore those experiences and we dismiss them so that we can preserve these simplistic models
Yeah,
of
exactly.
what's wrong. So,
Yeah. I guess in the book you discuss Henri Corbin a bit, the imaginal.
yeah.
What's helpful there? But I've really enjoyed reading his thoughts about the sort of 11th century Sufis, and it's a very yeah, he's a very deep thinker and writer. The books are really quite wonderful to read. I feel like he deserves to be a little bit more known. But yeah, what for you from Corbin was really helpful or
Well,
kind of,
so Corbin's one of my own ancestors. I mean, he's in the lineage of the study of religion. That's what Henri Corbin was, and he was a French intellectual who died. I want to say he died in 79. I'm going to just guess. He died during the Islamic Revolution as it was just getting going in Iran, by the way, and he was an expert on Iranian Islam, Shia Islam, and Sufism, and he developed this category that he called the imaginal, and he invoked this French coinage um, because he wanted to get away from the imaginary again. That there was this. He felt so he knew strongly from his Sufi sources that there was this middle realm that mediates between the transcendent and the immanent, and it was called he called it the imaginal realm. And so it functions as a way in his work to break down this idea that religious visions and mystical experiences are imaginary or they're hallucinations, as they say today. He wanted to challenge that deeply. Um, you know, he was also really active at a place called Oranos, and was very much a part of that community. Where I want to call him into question is, first of all, he didn't invent the category of the imaginal, even though he might have coined that particular term. It actually goes back to Frederick Myers again and to entomology, where it referred to where the insect, the larval form, was headed, i.e., to the imaginal. The imaginal was a term in entomology about the mature form of the insect, essentially.
Mhm.
And Myers then picked it up and talked about the imaginal as psychical capacities are where evolution is headed. So when we have a precognitive experience or a telepathic experience, these are evolutionary buds. These are imaginal characteristics for Myers that speak to our future evolution that, of course, we're not at. And so we have these sort of wild or spontaneous moments that we think are anomalous, but they're actually not.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, the image he gave or the story he told was, it's like the caterpillar meeting the butterfly.
Yeah.
You know, you just the caterpillar has no idea that he will someday be a butterfly, and yet he will be,
Yeah.
because there are these imaginal places in his body that become the winged butterfly. And so this was the image that Myers used, is that essentially we have a butterfly in us, and that we're more larval now. We're the wormy caterpillar now, but we'll evolve into something greater.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Do you still hold to that, or you just hold it lightly as a possibility?
So I think something like evolution does happen,
Yeah.
clearly. Um, I think that beliefs like that or systems like that produce themselves. I think they're invocative. So if you have a depressing dystopian worldview, you're going to help produce a dystopian, depressed future.
I mean,
And if you
the
if
Buddha headline, as perceived, so appears.
Yeah, yeah. If you have a much more positive or ecstatic, or in this case, in Meyer's case, a kind of evolutionary esotericism, I think it's going to tend to produce itself. I think you're going to tend to get whatever it is you imagine is the case. Certainly, that idea that there's some kind of esoteric evolution was prominent throughout the 20th and now 21st century, and I think we're
In the West,
looking
in
at
the West, in the Western tradition,
yeah,
not
yeah,
the Eastern tradition.
yeah. I mean, you can find it as well, actually, in Asia. Of course, it's not Darwinian, it's not evolutionary in any kind of literal sense, but there is a sense, certainly in a lot of Asian cultures, that human life is developmental. That we're moving towards some kind of greater and greater wisdom or gnosis or enlightenment or whatever the model is. Reincarnation and transmigration do have a kind of developmental sensibility to them. It's not evolutionary in the Darwinian or the 20th century sense, but I think that conversation is really useful to have.
I started studying Frederick Myers when I was preparing a course on the history of the Western Hermetic tradition, and I discovered that the whole story about his death. I mean, I guess he had a group of friends, and they were all fascinated with like mediumship and communicating with spirits and so on. And apparently, they made kind of like an internal wager that whoever died first from the group was going to try to like communicate back from the other world. And Meyer was writing this magnum opus, The Survival of the Human Personality After Bodily Death, which is like, I don't know, 1,500 pages. It never got finished during his life. It was released after he died. And then apparently, a few years after he died, different mediums got these messages from this guy, Frederick Meyer. And Meyer was like, tell my friends, get them together. I want to talk to them. I got stuff to say. And then they actually published a whole series of books where Meyer goes into great depth around his experience of the afterlife as this kind of, he talked about it as like this other reality that was made up of a slightly different particle, I believe. Like there were like schools, people had families, they went to work, but that was also somehow a very like, imaginal construction. And if you sort of began to realize that you were just in this kind of like transparent, realm of this, kind of other particle, you could then move into more kind of heightened states. I don't know if you know much about that, and
Well,
mhm.
I mean, we call those the cross correspondences. I mean, there is this kind of post life. of Myers through these cross correspondences, and they're designed to establish the survival hypothesis, the idea that the soul lives on in some form. Um, Again, I think we should have that conversation, Daniel. And by we, I mean, over many generations. I think that should be part of that should be in the cultural water is exactly that conversation. Whether the human personality survives bodily death and for how long, I don't know. And I don't say that skeptically or reductively. I just don't know. Um, what I do know is that we die into our imaginations.
How do
And
you know
I
that?
know,
How do you know that?
well, well, of course I don't know a death. I mean, well, okay. How do I know that? So, experiencers again. If you listen to people who have had near-death experiences, they're very different, and yet they're also similar. So there's something that's translating those experiences that is cultural or religious often, but they also, if you look at those experiences as a whole, you do get a sense of a death process or some kind of greater life that is outside the body or after death. And I also think the whole history of religions is very much about death and very much about near-death experiences. And it's also about what happens to us when we die. And different religions have different models of that. It's not one model or one certainty. I think it's a whole bunch of certainties. And this is what I mean by we die into our imaginations is I think um, children, for example, or people who remember previous lives are working with a many life model, and people who have experienced some kind of transcendent God or single life model have a very different set of experiences. So I want to take those all. What I'm trying to say is I want to put those all on the table, and I want to think about all of those together, and not just assume a one life model or assume a reincarnation model.
Yeah,
And
I guess,
maybe they're both true, Daniel.
well,
Maybe
yeah,
it depends on what we think.
sure. I mean, I'm sure you've read like Patrick Harpur's work, right?
I
The
have.
idea that the sort of Western concept that we are, in this literal physical reality. He sort of questions that from an indigenous perspective, how
Mhm.
the body is as much, allegorical as it is literal, and can be kind of like pulled in, taken into this other realms. Like for them, there wasn't such the hard and fast distinctions that we have. But I'm wondering, so I guess when I think about this stuff in my own mind, I've put together kind of like a construct, which involves kind of like, analytic or monistic idealism. Bernardo Kastrup, but I was already writing about it, before I knew about Kastrup, but Emmett Swami or even Steiner was a monistic idealist. This idea that actually, everything is consciousness.
Yeah.
And consciousness is the foundational reality, and everything, material and physical, a universe, a planet, a bookshelf, is actually sort of, you know, temporary concretion of that underlying field of consciousness that has to create, these explorations and investigations. Otherwise, it can't even know itself or create anything. It's just sort of in the potentiality state. And so there's that idea, which also I think it really frees us to allow, for all sorts of possibilities, as you're saying, that these different imaginal visions of the, afterlife, other dimensions and so on, all of them could have some kind of validity in some sense. And then there's kind of Rupert Sheldrake and his idea of kind of like morphogenetic fields and morphic resonance, that yeah, that there might be kind of like patterns. If the universe is made of consciousness, and as we've grown into consciousness as a species, we've had all these little local cultures around the planet. So you go to an indigenous culture, like I visited a bunch of them. Like you go to the Kogi, and they have a magic. They have a divination system. They have a way of understanding what it means if like a hummingbird comes into your room at night, or what it means if they take this cotton and they put their thought reflections into it, and then bury it in a certain place or something. And it actually works quite well within their context. And then you go to the Shipibo in Peru or the Hopi in Arizona, they have a different magic and a different set of practices that also seem to work, at least until they come into contact with like a Western, materialist kind of psyche in a way. But the idea is that, my idea is they've lived in these places for, thousands, tens of thousands of years, and they've kind of woven a morphogenetic field that includes the field of like language and myth and the particular plants and the stones and the elements. And that has taken them, in a direction far enough away from the sort of median or the norm of humanity that, yeah, they have these forms of magic or these forms of divination or even these veils of like future soul making or something that are just their own thing, because consciousness is kind of like defining that kind of dimensional reality in some sense. Does that resonate with your kind of like thinking about it in a way?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, the question I have I always have is, well, what is the people in Peru have to do with the people in Arizona or the people in North Africa? I mean, there is there a broader or more global reality that the species, shares or inhabits, and how can we talk about the species as a whole, or eventually how can we talk about the cosmos as a whole, and not a particular culture, which I think we're always. This is what I mean by thinking impossibly. I don't think we can inhabit that Peruvian worldview anymore. Maybe they can, but I don't think we can. And so the question is, what kind of worldview do we inhabit today? And to me, something that's global and takes it all in, and keeps it all on the table, is more adequate and hopeful than something that um, returns everything back to a particular religious or scientific system, I guess. I
Yeah,
guess that's what
I'm
a
trying. I'm meaning to kind of say the sort of opposite, in a way. It's like, if there's this underlying field of consciousness and these sort of
yeah.
morphogenetic fields of particularity where, cultures or, kind of, religions form, then it's kind of both and, right? I mean, it's, so like, when I had my experiences, writing Breaking Open the Head, I had an experience where I took a synthetic psychedelic deep dipropyl in my apartment with a friend, and we had like it was very like Aleister Crowley-esque. It was very like Western occult. Like we had these like beings. They were in these like velvet dresses and suits. They were sneering at us, like like in this very hot. They were very haughty, and then one of them kind of like seemed to kind of like stay with me and was haunting my dreams and causing like psychic phenomena. And that went on for like a few months. Um, but I had no conscious connection at that point to the Western occult tradition. And I
Yeah.
was just talking to another friend of mine who's a fantastic thinker and writer, and he had a very very similar thing happen where he had different mushroom experiences and different transcending experiences, but they all fit in with kind of like Aleister Crowley's path. And he
Right.
wasn't a Crowleyite or anything. He only learned about it like after the fact. So it feels like if you're a Western person and you go on some kind of initiatory journey into like the occult or the paranormal, you're likely to experience it within this kind of like a Western occult kind of cultural milieu or something, or it's like that's like the morphogenetic field that we're in from our like ancestors, from our cultural conditioning, from our language, from our poetry and our religion and so on. Whereas it's not the case for somebody, in Gabon or in Colombia or something like that, from an indigenous culture.
I mean, that's a model of the imagination. I mean, your analytic idealism is in fact an answer to what the imagination is, and but it empowers the human subject in an extraordinary way, right? I mean, you're offering a model or a worldview that can somehow explain all of these different cultures, but you're offering this meta view, which I think is great. I mean, I think that is the conversation, Daniel. And I don't I mean, I understand how someone who lives in the morphogenetic field of Western culture can recreate Aleister Crowley. I get that, but I I guess I don't live in that world. You know, I want to take the South Asian Hindu as seriously as the Mahayana Buddhist Chinese practitioner, or the Taoist, or the Hopi. I mean, it's all part of the human experience, or the experience that I want to develop. I want us, not me. I want us to develop some kind of model or worldview that can affirm all of these different cultural approximations, as there was, or maybe they're not approximations. Again, maybe they're cultural instantiations, like you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm exactly in the same place. Like I can, consider myself an idealist, an esoteric Christian, and like Rudolf Steiner's cosmology, an animist, and a Dzogchen.
Yeah.
I completely am a huge fan of Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, particularly Dzogchen. As soon as I read that stuff, I like click right into that.
So one of the things that I say a lot, and just to kind of encourage you, I talk a lot to people in the human potential movement, and one of my jokes is it's called the human potential movement. It's not called the human accomplishment movement. And there is this forward-looking kind of orientation to the future, that we don't yet have the answers, but we're working toward them, as opposed to what I call believing back, where we're affirming someone else's, some ancestor's altered state, but we're not really listening to our own, or listening to the people around us. And I'm much more in that latter camp. I obviously, in terms of just my language, I do think like you, that there's something that's being spoken that is more comparative or global or species oriented than it has to do with a particular culture or a particular set of ancestors. But that's a normative claim, Daniel. But I want to own that, and I want other people to own that, and I want us to push forward there.
Yeah. Uh, so many wonderful topics that I want to keep diving in with you, maybe in this event, maybe in subsequent hangouts also. But I wanted to sort of ask you, well, I mean, I hope you find this funny. Who do you think is the most successful occult practitioner of our time?
I know what you're thinking. Um, yeah, it depends on, of course, what I would say back is how we measure success. I
Yeah,
think, um,
what caused the biggest perturbations in the field, let's say.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, clearly we know the answer to that. So I think where we're going with this is sort of this question about what is the relationship between magic and occultism and politics,
Hmm.
or what is the relationship between occultism and conspiracy theory, is another way of putting it. And you know, my response to that is complicated, which we can get into. I'm happy to talk
I,
about
I
that.
love complicated responses. I didn't come
Yeah,
for one word answers, Jeffrey.
it is complicated. Um, one again, I like to tell jokes, and one of my jokes is that the greatest conspiracy theory of all time is called the humanities. If you want to be suspicious of everything for the rest of your life, just study the humanities. Just you will never believe anything ever again.
That's why they're trying to dismantle it right now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, but my point is that suspicion and this idea that reality ain't what it looks like is integral to the whole history of human culture, and certainly integral to the history of religions. And the Western Academy, if we want to speak about the Academy, it literally begins with a conspiracy theory called Plato's Cave. It literally begins with this idea that what the senses are picking up is not actually what is there, and that there's this greater truth to be had that is not what the people think. and we can name all kinds of conspiracies or ideas like that in history, and we would recognize them as Gnostic or Sufi or mystical, or I mean we could go on and on like this. So I think the relationship between conspiracy or suspicion about a particular worldview and the religious life is a very complicated one. I think the basic difference is, to kind of speak to the conspiracy theory, the way people talk about conspiracy theory today is there's no conversation there. There's no uncertainty. The conspiracy theories are too damn certain. There's not a reflection back that okay, well, where is the data? How do we establish this? How do you know that? Why do you say that? Those kinds of conversations, Daniel, are not had, at least in the public forum. And there's just these narratives that come out that are simplistic, that there's some kind of deep state, there's some kind of reality isn't what it looks like. But there isn't this, okay, well, where are your sources? Give me some, give me some hard examples of this. That kind of conversation doesn't happen, and I think that's what we need to have, is that harder conversation that's much broader and deeper than just pulling out some kind of conspiracy idea.
Yeah. I mean, so you mentioned that one of your big interests was kind of like Eros and esotericism or eroticism.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I'm curious, probably a lot to kind of like kind of condense, but I'm curious if there's like how you understand the relationship between eroticism and esotericism, let's say. You know.
Again, I think it's really complicated. I think this is what gets taken off the table
Yeah.
is, I mean, for example, let's take abduction experiences, which I think are in some ways the most interesting because they're the most outrageous and absurd from a literal kind of a secular sensibility, but they're really patently obvious to the experiencer. These things actually appear and are very real. But these experiences often involve sexuality in really complicated ways. It's not always straight sexuality. There's often reproduction involved. There are hybrids. There are tinglings at the base of the spine. There's Kundalini-like phenomena. I mean, there's all kinds of um, sexual engendered themes that come up in the abduction experience, but they don't tend to get focused on because they're embarrassing and they're confusing, I think, to people, which I understand. I'm confused as well, but I think again we need to focus on those things. So just to kind of take it back, one of the things I often say is that the history of mystical experience is a very queer history, and by queer I mean it in the positive, critical, theoretical sense that gender and sexuality are very fluid, and it's not at all clear what the gender identity or what the sexuality is sometimes of these ecstatic mystical states. And I think this then flows into modern near-death experiences and abduction experiences, and sexuality comes up big time. If you talk to the experiencers and if you really get them to trust you, they will often talk about this element of the experience, but they'll do it in a way that doesn't make a whole lot of sense culturally, because the culture, I think, is wrong about this one.
Yeah. I guess I'm sort of trying to wind my way around to a little bit. It's kind of like, we're in a very particular, moment in, the United States's trajectory. We're approaching 250 years. We're in like the Pluto return, so they say. And, we have this kind of like second American Revolution happening, where the sort of constitutional system, one could say, is being kind of like dismantled by the Supreme Court and the executive branch and so on. And meanwhile, there's this, what's explosively powering this, are a number of things. white Christian nationalism, frustration, working class frustration, um, Christian, apocalypticism, and so on. It feels like a very occult situation to me, in that it feels very, or psychedelic, feels like we've all collectively chosen to go on like a very bad, dark psychedelic initiation together. Um, and it feels like the quality of our time is shifting in ways that are hard to fully articulate. But it's interesting, at this very moment in which we're speaking, this whole Jeffrey Epstein thing and this sort of, the connection between like Eros, the forces, maybe the chthonic forces of the occult, um, the elite power as a kind of ceremonial or ritual kind of like expression. Like, I'm just curious if you've any thoughts on all of that. I know I'm throwing a bunch of stuff at you there from your own study of the paranormal, the supernormal, and the occult. I mean, and Eros too. What do you think is happening right now?
Well, so I don't know about the Epstein case. Let's put that aside because I just don't know, Daniel. I haven't read enough and I don't know enough about that. But I do I do think this moment, this larger moment you're speaking to, is very obvious. And the sense I feel a lot is I told you so.
Yeah.
It's like, no shit. It's like we've been saying this for decades, if not hundreds of years. We've known that the truth is constructed for a long time in the humanities. And we have developed ways to talk about this and think about this that I think are quite responsible and fascinating. And yes, it's true that the public has not listened to people who have developed these models. But like take the comparative study of religion. It's been around for 150 years, Daniel. We've known that there are many religions for a long, long time, and we've gone through different stages and different models for this, and we've been struggling with this for a century and a half now. And suddenly it's an issue or a problem for a particular group of the society. Well, okay, but we've been doing that for a long time, and we do have the tools to handle that and to think through that. Um, that those very tools or that those very institutions are being dismantled, I think is a part of me is like, well, they finally understand that we're serious and that we actually are saying something that's very real and that's very important here. So any kind of attention is in some even negative attention, like I think a lot of people are getting now is good attention because it's at least an acknowledgement that the critique is important, whether that's a critique around class or gender or sexuality or race or the ecology or this occultism. I think is also a critique of sort. This was kind of one of the points of Authors of the Impossible is if you look at actually people's actual occult experiences, they're often communicating some desire to get out of a particular story and to tell a new one. And so I think kind of that's where we're at in the culture is we're trying to get out of these previous set of stories that have hurt people and are simply not working anymore. And we're trying to tell new stories. But some of the old stories are good too. So I think we're kind of in this mixing and matching kind of place, this transitional place that's very difficult to be in.
And in terms of the trajectory of like the work that you're doing around, the superhuman and the impossible, the superhumanities and the impossible. Yeah, I mean, do you feel that the sort of like deconstruction of the academy, the sort of establishment of knowledge, is there a connection there to maybe like the kind of repression of certain ideas and so on?
Well, I call it the superhumanities for a reason. I mean, I think that the humanities have coded into them the superhuman. I think the human is too, as I say, and that human beings are constantly experiencing themselves as much greater, much more cosmic than their social selves. Um, so I think this criticism, certainly of the academy, is partly our fault, is partly the academy's fault, because it has suppressed this superhuman aspect. It's turned the humanities into this horizontal kind of secular exercise, and I think that's a terrible mistake. Um, so what I mean by the superhuman, I don't mean some glorified social ego or some glorified nationalism. I mean I mean the near-death experience. I mean the psychedelic trip. I mean this experience that we're more than we think we are. That's what I mean by the super. The super is simply that which is beyond or over or after. And I think the way we've conceived of the human is really bad, Daniel. I think we have to completely reconceive ourselves and reimagine what a human being is and the place in the cosmos. And I think that's extremely painful.
A little exciting, a little titillating too.
Um, for yeah, I mean, certainly for an intellectual, we love things that take apart and deconstruct a previous worldview and sort of have some hope of some future worldview. So yeah, it is. But see, this is what the history of religions is. It's one story telling another story that it's inadequate and mistaken, and it's replacing that old story with a new story. And then that new story becomes an old story and it gets replaced, and then so on and so on and so on. That's been going on for as far as we can see back. And so I don't see that stopping, Daniel. But I think, again, we're in a moment where we're recognizing that the stories that we're in are broken and that they don't work, and we're trying to get out of those stories and tell different ones. And again, I don't know what those different ones are, but your analytic idealism and your invocation of Bernardo Castro, that's a new story. That's a but it's a new story with roots in the superhumanities, by the way. If you read Bernardo, what you actually read is books on Jung and Schopenhauer, and I mean, you read he goes back to these classical figures, and he rereads them as pointing towards this idealism. And I think he's absolutely correct to do that, by the way.
I think
But that's what I mean by the superhumanities.
another vector that I'm fascinated with. Actually, I was going to interview him. I think I'm going to talk to him next week for my podcast. There's a Toltec shaman, Sergio Magana, and I didn't know about him when I wrote my 2012 book. I wrote a book about the Mayan and the Hopi prophecies and so on.
Yeah.
But Magana came out later, and he wrote a book called The Dawn of the Sixth Sun. And
Uh-huh.
that from his elders in the sort of Toltec and Aztec tradition, they had a slightly different, I mean, related but slightly different cosmology to the Maya. That for them, we were, shifting over to the sixth sun from the fifth sun. And the period of like 2012, 2022 was the sort of transition. And the fifth sun was a sun of light, and the sixth sun was a sun of darkness. So we were moving into this polarity shift. And as he explained it, this was probably back in like 2010 or something. But like the um, the time of a sun of light, for them, is kind of like means a time when the predominant kind of like tonality or frequency of human consciousness is focused on the daylight world, on the waking clarity of the sunlight and empiricism and connection to material things and rational thought and quantification. As it toggles back over to the sun of darkness, which sounds a little bit threatening, according to Magana writing years ago, what was going to happen is that reality was going to become more dreamlike, more psychically available or psychically malleable, and
Yeah.
reality itself would become more and more like a dream. And I sort of feel that that's like one of the best descriptions of what seems to be happening as we have like AI and fake news and we don't even know what's real from our authority structures are contaminated now. Like the White House is garbage, the New York Times, all these other media outlets seem kind of contaminated by you know, this corruption that's taken place in our whole information system. We're losing our scientific knowledge base, and yeah, it feels like we're plunging into this son of darkness in a way. I don't know how that resonates with you as an idea.
Well, it reminds me a lot of Ian McGilchrist and this, this idea that Western culture is dominated by the left hemisphere and this sort of rational, linguistic, kind
Yeah,
of mathematical approach to reality, and that what needs to happen is we need balance. We don't need to go to the
yeah,
right hemisphere and just start to affirm symbol and myth and intuition and art and stuff. But we need to somehow bring those things back and create a more integral balance between the two. Um, I also think, this is where the humanities come in. I think this idea that darkness is scary is frankly a racist thing. I think white people say that, but my colleagues in Black critical studies are like, well, what's scary about darkness or blackness? I mean, it's like this is good, this is beneficent, and so I think that kind of language or that kind of sensibility, and I'm agreeing with you here, Daniel, we should not be afraid of darkness or blackness. We should embrace it as part of the human experience and part of who we are. But I think we need to listen to Black critical theory, is what I'm trying to say, which would critique that kind of language and critique that kind of binary, which of course is riven throughout the whole history of the planet. I understand that. I mean, because of the day and night cycle, likely.
yeah. I mean, to be clear, he was actually saying that while darkness as an idea could seem scary, it was
Yeah,
just
no, I get it. No, I get it. It does seem scary. I mean, it's been scary to us, but not to everyone, is what I'm trying to say.
yeah. But going into a period of sort of high-tech surveillance, high-tech weaponry, and sort of Christian fanaticism and chaos. It is a bit scary right now. Climate chaos, ecological breakdown, and so on. I mean, it is easy to
Well,
get overwhelmed in all of that.
and again, absolutely, yes. And you know, I guess kind of where I'm trying to come from is, look, we've been saying these things for a long time, and and absolutely this has gotten out of control, and absolutely this is bad. But it's been bad for a long time, Daniel. And we're more aware of the badness now, or we're more aware of the breakdown now, but it's been breaking down for a long time. Um, Certainly in my life, it's been breaking down. I mean, I grew up like you in the 70s. I grew up in the midst of nuclear armament, and I really didn't think I would live to see 40. I thought the entire planet would be decimated by a nuclear exchange, and the whole climate and all of the speed, everything would be gone. And that could still happen, you know. But again, that's been going on at least since the 1970s, or the 1960s or the 1950s, however far you want to go back. That people have been saying these, and a lot of the things in philosophy, by the way, are the result of the world wars and the Holocaust, and I mean, things were really really awful in the early 20 first half of the 20th century. Um, so again, I think that kind of memory is really useful here because it puts um, our present dysfunction and our present mistakes in a bigger context. And that's not to forgive them.
Yeah.
I'm not forgiving them or dismissing them. I'm saying let's look at this in this broader context, which I think does change how we think of things.
Yeah, thank you. Listen, thank you for your time. I'm going to ask you maybe just one more question, then we'll roll it up for
Yeah,
today.
yeah.
Other agendas. But kind of curious about, yeah, like what kind of, based on the sense that there's kind of this world of the impossible that we need to kind of like integrate into our ontology and philosophy of metaphysics. And yeah, the sort of trajectory of current events and the sort of maybe the sense of the esoteric and the occult coming back, but maybe not in the most healthy way right now. What kind of advice do you give to, would you give to people? I mean, young people who are sort of like trying to make sense of the situation, or thinkers who are trying to write into it or reflect on it. What do you think is a useful kind of toolkit for people?
I mean, one of the things again, I'm still, I mean, I work with young people every day. I walk into a classroom, so I'm very aware of what 18 and 19-year-olds think and don't think. Um, but one of the things that I think is helpful about the occult or the impossible is what I call the traumatic secret. And the basic idea is that extraordinary things happen because they're trying to communicate with people. And they're happening in context of suffering and breakdown, and they're trying to heal that breakdown or that suffering. And maybe they're not doing it very well. Maybe it's a cry of the heart, or it's a cry of just the breakdown. But I think us listening to those experiences is really important, because it's us listening to us, I think. I think we are listening to another aspect of who we are that's greater. This is what I call the superhuman or the humanist too. But I also think these stories are breaking down, and that's precisely why these voices or why these communications are coming, is because something is not working right and something's trying to take its place. And so that's what I keep saying. This is about communication. This is about language. This is about text. This is about some kind of push forward. So there's suffering here, yes, but there's also healing, or there's a potential healing. I guess that's the more positive message, which is very genuine.
Yeah.
I'm not just saying that.
Yeah. Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much. I love your work. Love talking to you, and look forward to more. Let's maybe sometime we'll do something with a third person, do a little triangle and triangulation.
Yeah. What I'll remember is it's complex. there are there aren't simple answers, and that you personally like the complexity. I mean, I like the complexity too. I think things are really complicated,
Yeah.
and that's if we can just leave the viewer with that. I mean, um, there aren't simple answers to these questions, and that's why they're great questions.
All right. Well, listen, have a great day. I see Valis on your shelf. I see Timothy Leary staring back.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. There. Wait. I guess there's Tim, and
Put that up
there's
very carefully there. It looks like. Yeah.
yeah. There's
Uh,
also right here. Right here is Aldous Huxley, by the way, Doors of
oh,
Perception.
all right. Cool. Interesting. Cool. Yeah, I like the shelf. All right. Have a great night, and we'll speak soon.